Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar on elevating carbon accounting. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes just to, a few seconds. I'll give till 1 minute after 12:30 so that we can make the best use of our time. These have a tendency to be pretty rich and dense with material, and I want to make sure I get to everyone's questions. So let's give it 30 seconds and then we will just kick it off. Okay, we're at 1 minute after, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Alyssa Rade. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain.Life. And what we're going to talk about in today's webinar is all about how to elevate your carbon accounting for your business. So just a quick agenda of how we will run today's webinar. I'm going to contextualize a little bit of what's going on right now with evolving market demands, both pressures coming from customers, investors that you might be feeling at your business, as well as the regulatory environment and what we have under development here in the US. Then I'm going to focus on a carbon accounting primer, just to make sure that everyone in the room understands what we're talking about here. And I see something happening in the chat right now. Yes, I'll get to some Q&A at the end. I'm going to do a brief demo of our Sustain.Life app to show you how you can start measuring your emissions and translate your business activities over to emissions outputs. And then at the end, we'll get to Q&A. Please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. And then anything that I don't have a chance to get to at the end, like I said, these have a tendency to go right up until our allotted time. I will do my best to provide written responses and circulate with the full audience here. And we can do that along with the deck as well. So let's go ahead and get started and make the best use of our time. So why are we here? Why is sustainability a top priority? Companies are prioritizing sustainability because it's becoming evident that ESG, which is of course environmental, social, and governance, ESG risks and opportunities materially impact a company's ability to create long-term value. So from the risk perspective, the top 3 risks that companies are worried about today are 1, fines and compliance, 2, poor resiliency, and 3, losing customer trust. And that may resonate with many of you in the audience today. On the flip side, the top opportunities that companies are focusing on are really all about the customer. And that's about attracting customers based on company values. Similarly to that, integrating a sustainable value proposition into branding, and then winning customers with more sustainable products. So what we're seeing here is just some context on some real market forces driving companies to invest in their sustainability programs today. Okay. Now, aside from the market pressures and the market forces, there's also regulatory implications evolving across many jurisdictions, but most notably in the US here today. So maybe you're a public company and you're impacted by the SEC's proposed rule on climate disclosure, which essentially requires, it's a proposed rule, the comment period just passed just at the end of June, or I'm sorry, just the other day. And it essentially will require all public companies to disclose their climate-related risks as well as their greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe you're a public company that's directly impacted by that rule. However, maybe you're not a public company, maybe you're a private company, and while you're not directly mandated by the rule, you do business with public companies. And because public companies under this rule have to report what's called their Scope 3 value chain emissions, which I will get into when we go through the whole taxonomy of emissions terminology. But because these public companies have to disclose their Scope 3 value chain emissions, which means emissions that come from their supply chain, if you're a private company that does business with one of these large public companies, you're now being asked by your customers to disclose your greenhouse gas emissions. And so you now need to measure and report these things, even though you're not directly mandated by this law. Okay, so that's just a little bit of the context on what's going on. I do want to mention we do offer a pretty robust blog that helps provide a lot more context on this evolving regulatory landscape. So I do encourage those in the audience to do your research, go check out the Sustain.Life blog where we do, what we're seeking to do there is just educate you and contextualize why things are evolving here in the US and some of the forces and different players involved when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions accounting and then disclosing that in a public forum. So let's jump into today. Whether you're compelled by those market forces or the regulatory developments, you've probably found yourself here at this webinar for one of 2 reasons. Maybe you've heard about these things, but you're feeling overwhelmed, you're lost, you don't entirely know where to start. If you're not a sustainability expert, maybe you're in operations or a trusted person or operations person at your company that a boss or manager has tasked to kind of put sustainability and carbon accounting on your plate for 2022. Or maybe you actually are pretty well versed here. You do know what's going on. You're familiar with carbon accounting, but you don't have the time or resources to actually compile a comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory. And you're looking for tools and resources to aid you in that. And that, of course, is where Sustain.Life comes in. So we help companies without the deep expertise or Fortune 500 budgets take meaningful climate action. And we do that in 3 key ways. We operate on these 3 pillars of measure, manage, report. And from the measure side, this is all about measuring your carbon emissions and your environmental impact, both internal to your operation, as well as external from your supply chain. Then on the management piece, we actually help companies manage their operational impact across key areas that contribute to those emissions. So that's things like energy, water, and waste to actually reduce your business footprint. We also highlight opportunities for your organization to better manage ESG-related risks and opportunities. And that can be everything from protecting your assets and supply chain against extreme weather events to the transitional risks of more volatile energy or even carbon markets. And lastly, we have report. And that's reporting audit grade data to your customers, your investors, your employees, and in time, regulators with transparency and integrity. So that's all I'm going to focus on in terms of a little introduction to Sustain.Life. I really want to focus on here today is carbon accounting and getting back to what we've all shown up here before. So let's get back to that topic at hand. Okay, so what we're here to talk about is emissions accounting. And you may hear, and I've probably actually already used a couple different terms to describe that, right? We hear carbon accounting, carbon inventory, emissions footprint, carbon footprint, and sometimes just the shorthand carbon. But what we're talking about here against all of these terms is the same idea, and that's all about quantifying the amount of greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere from your business activities. So let's take a step back for a second and just set the stage and anchor ourselves in some foundational, fundamental, likely grade school information, greenhouse gases, right? So these are naturally occurring gases in the atmosphere that absorb energy. And this is part of how the Earth's radiative budget works. So the sun emits energy in the form of heat down towards the Earth. And a lot of that energy gets absorbed by our biosphere, by land, by plants, by animals, by oceans. But a fair bit of it actually bounces off of the Earth's surface and goes back out into space, and that's called reflection. And it's the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that act as an insulating blanket, keeping some of that heat on Earth. So they're naturally occurring, they are what allow the Earth to be habitable, but as we all know, they've drastically increased in concentration since the Industrial Revolution, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels. And so now that insulating effect, that warming effect, is in fact too strong. So when we think about global warming, we often think about carbon dioxide. But I do want to call attention to the fact that there are other greenhouse gases that trap heat. So those other greenhouse gases include things like nitrous oxides, which are released from agriculture, from land use and industrial activities, in addition to burning fossil fuels. You also have methane, which is also commonly released from agriculture and livestock. You may have heard about that in relationship to cows, as well as coal processing and landfills, again, as well as combustion of fossil fuels. And then you have some nastier gases called fluorinated gases. And these have long chemical names like like hydrofluorocarbons and fluorofluorocarbons. And what you need to know about these gases is that they are not naturally occurring. They are man-made, and they're often used in industrial processes, often industrial cooling as refrigerants. So now what the emissions accounting process does is it takes all of these different gases that are emitted through different business activities that I just mentioned a few examples of, and it converts them into a common unit of measure, which is called CO2e, or a carbon dioxide equivalent. And that is honestly why we call it carbon accounting, because there's a little bit of math involved to get these gases from their form into this CO2e common unit of measure. And I'm going to walk you through how that works. And so if we really want to get into the weeds on this, the relationship of carbon dioxide to all of those other greenhouse gases is based off of what's called their global warming potential. And all of that is a factor of the heat absorbed by that gas over the time that it lasts in the atmosphere. And so as a result, it's insulating power. So let's just go through an example here, methane, which is commonly used as the primary example to talk about global warming potential. So methane has a global warming potential, or a GWP, of 28. which means that 1 metric ton of methane has an insulating power over 28 times that of CO2 over a 100-year period. So that 1 metric ton of methane is equivalent to 28 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. Now, those fluorinated gases that I spoke about, the long ones, hydrofluorocarbons, chlorofluorocarbons, the ones that are used as refrigerants, they have global warming potentials in the thousands. Okay, so if those gases have higher global warming potentials, even methane has a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, why are we always talking about carbon dioxide, right? Why is it CO2e that's this common unit of measure? And it's because even though all of those other gases are more powerful insulators than carbon dioxide, they're also less stable. They bounce around in the atmosphere and the air, they bump up against other particles, and they change their chemical composition. So they actually change from being that greenhouse gas. And so overall, over a long period of time, it's carbon dioxide that's actually the most powerful greenhouse gas because it's the most stable. It stays in the atmosphere on account of centuries, whereas those other gases will last along the lines of more like decades. Okay, so that's CO2e, that's carbon accounting. That's where we're going to stop the light level of math for today. But now I want to get into the different categorization of emissions. And at a very high level, you can break emissions into 2 buckets, and that's direct emissions and indirect emissions. So direct emissions are activities that your business directly controls. Okay, so this I want you to think of any time essentially your company is actually burning the fuel. So this is if you own or control buildings or vehicles or equipment, and you're powering those with the fossil fuel, with natural gas, with diesel, with coal, but you're actually burning that those fuels. Indirect emissions, on the other hand, are activities that support your business operation, but they're outside of your control. And they can be bifurcated into 2 different categories of upstream, which is just everything that you purchase or acquire, or downstream, which is everything that your business that is related to the good or service that your business provides or sells. And the most common example of indirect emissions is something like electricity. So your company consumes the electricity, but it doesn't generate the electricity. That happens at a power plant off-site. And so that's an indirect emission because even though it's required to support your business operation, your business isn't the one actually burning the fossil fuels and releasing all of those emissions into the atmosphere. So that's an example of an indirect emission. Okay, now that we have the distinction of direct and indirect, let's get into scopes. Okay, now there's 3 scopes, scopes 1, 2, and 3. And I want you to think of this as just the standard framework of how you can bucket emissions into more granular categories. And I'm going to teach you a shorthand that actually got me through grad school. I'm thinking about patenting it because I really think it's very helpful, but it's the 3 B's of burn, buy, and beyond. So let's start with scope 1, which is burn. So scope 1 emissions are those direct emissions. These are the only direct emissions. And these are the ones that come from burning fossil fuels at sources your business owns or controls. So I want you to think of this as the gas in company-owned cars, heating oil or natural gas to fuel building systems, propane or diesel to fuel company-owned equipment. If your company pays the fuel bill directly or owns the asset, they likely have scope 1 emissions. And so the good way to remember that is burn, because again, your business is burning that fuel and directly creating the emission. The next part I want to talk about is scope 2, which I want everyone to think about as buy. Okay, and these are those indirect energy related emissions. So this is when your company buys power or energy, but that it's generated somewhere else. And again, that's the example of electricity that I walked through earlier, right? You're consuming the electricity, but it's generated offsite. It's the power plant that's actually burning the fuels to release the emissions, where your company is just consuming the resulting electricity. And then the other examples of scope 2 emissions are if you purchase any steam, heating, or cooling capacity like chilled water that again is generated somewhere else, but your business is purchasing the cooling capacity or the heating or the steam energy. Okay, so now we're going to get into scope 3, the more nebulous scope 3 emissions. And I want you to think of this as beyond. Okay, and this reflects everything, all the activities that support your business, the upstream and the downstream, everything that your vendors, your suppliers, your customers, your employees, your product, everything that happens in relationship to your business. Okay, and so let's walk through an example of what some typical scope 3 emissions could look like. Let's take, for example, if you're a t-shirt manufacturing company. So if you were to start with an emissions accounting exercise, you would start with scope 1 and 2. That's generally where businesses start. They are, again, related to energy. They're a little bit easier to measure and get data for. And they're also the easiest to control, right? There's a very literal relationship to energy consumption and emissions. So you're the t-shirt company, you are going to start with your scope 1 and 2. So let's say for scope 1, for burn, let's say that you are burning some diesel in your powered equipment. Let's say you're burning natural gas for space heating. Those are your scope 1 emissions. Now for scope 2, any purchased energy, indirect emissions, let's say there's electricity in your manufacturing facility to actually keep the lights on, and you also have some electrical equipment. Let's say you purchase steam as part of your manufacturing process to power some of your equipment. That's where you would start with scope 1 and 2. Now, when you go to scope 3, this is where you really need to go to fully capture the impact of your activities. And I do want to note that for most businesses, scope 3, although they're the hardest to measure and the most difficult to really wrap your arms around, they typically represent 90% of a business's emissions footprint. So they're really critical in representing a fair and accurate picture of your actual total carbon impact as a company. So now with the t-shirt manufacturer, scope 3 emissions could be anything from all of the energy required to process, extract, harvest the fibers that are used to make the cotton textile that ultimately would go into the t-shirt. Those would all be upstream emissions because the manufacturer is purchasing that cotton textile. The transit miles to deliver the cotton textile from their supplier over to their manufacturing facility. The miles of their employees in the factory that actually make the t-shirts getting to work to and from every day. And then on the back end, on the downstream side, an example could be at the end of its useful life of that t-shirt, assuming that it's not recycled, when it goes to a landfill and it decomposes and it releases methane and those other greenhouse gases, that's an example of an end of useful life, but of a scope 3 waste disposal emission. So for this scope 3 category, there are 15 different categories, and you'll want to screen what's material or important to your company so that you can then go and collect the data that you need that would actually reflect your business operation. Okay. And so that's really the deep dive on carbon accounting. If there's any questions on that, again, please send them through the Q&A. What I'd love to do now is actually do a quick demo to show you what it looks like to actually go and work with this data and how you can utilize a platform to translate those business activities to the emissions output. So with that, let me get to my demo here. Okay, so this is the Sustain.Life platform, and where I'm dropping you all right here is in the home screen of what we call our measurement piece. Remember, I mentioned that we operate on measure, manage, and report. But where a lot of businesses really want to get started is with that baseline measurement. They want to understand what's our impact today. We want to pursue activities and programs and initiatives that are going to lower that impact, but we need to know where we're starting today. And so we've designed this screen around progressive disclosure. And so at a very high level, what you're going to see here is across your entire operation, you may have many locations contributing. You may have warehouses and manufacturing facilities or offices and headquarters and satellite spaces. All of that rolled up into this high level summary right here. And what you're seeing is your total carbon dioxide equivalent emissions tracked against your total spend for all of the activities that are resulting in those emissions, and then any offsets that you might have purchased. And I also want to mention here that you won't see at this first level that scope 1, 2, 3, that classic hierarchy of greenhouse gas accounting. What we've done here in the platform is we translate those emissions categories into more intuitive categories of how you may think about your business. So what you're seeing here is the emissions specific to the buildings that you own or operate, to the waste that you generate, to the purchases you make, to your product footprint, to vehicles, so that as you start to gear programs and launch actual initiatives, you know if buildings are comprising most of your emissions, that's where you're going to want to focus on, deep energy retrofits, electrification, things like that. Okay. At this next level of disclosure, now we're breaking it into those scopes. And this is more for formal reporting and inventorying. If you are compelled by that SEC rule, or again, if you're being asked by your large public company customers to measure greenhouse gases, they're going to want to know your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And if you are compelled by the law, you're going to want to measure your scope 3 emissions. So here you're seeing the totals broken out that way, as well as the line items that go to support those. So you're seeing mobile combustion, here are the emissions from your vehicle fleet if you own cars as a company, right? fugitive emissions. We didn't talk about this, but these are chemical off-gassing that happens often in industrial processes and with heavy chemical applicants like fire suppression systems. But you'll see the line items of what's impacting and contributing to this overall scope emissions. And you see that across your 3 scopes here. Now at your next line of disclosure, we're going back to your intuitive building categories, but we're translating those specific line items back to your building categories. So where you had stationary combustion here, we know that to be a scope 1. You also know that stationary combustion happens in buildings. So you see how it contributes to your overall building. And then there's all different ways to look at this data. A lot of users are going to want to see the comparative emissions impact, but you may also want to see the spend. And so you can toggle between these different options and you can understand how these things are all comparing to one another. Okay. And then at the very bottom here, you just have a ledger view of all the activities that you've entered in the tool to date. All right, so let's get started here. I do want to just show you that you have the ability here to add a couple locations. So if you go to locations under your profile here, you can see we have lots of different locations. You can add a new one here. This is the information that you'd be entering. It's mostly address information. And the reason why that's important is because the system is actually connected into data sets where specific to your zip code of this location, anytime you're entering electricity information, we're actually pulling from the local grid specific to that area. So that if you're in Oakland and you're in California and your grid mix is comprised of a lot of renewables, you've got a lot of solar, for instance, that actually has a lower emissions impact than if you're maybe in the Rust Belt or coal country in the country, and your local grid has a higher emissions factor because there's actually more coal being burned or fossil fuels to generate that electricity compared to a more renewable mix. So that's why we're asking for this information here. Okay, so you can go and you can add all your locations. And then let's go through an example here of how you would actually engage. So buildings, again, is where a lot of users will start, right? This is going to be some of your scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's often data here, right? You're paying fuel bills or electricity bills. So when you drop in here, you're going to want to go to your configuration page. And this is where you're setting up the data that you want to track at this location. So here we're in this Oakland office. It's a typical office. They consume electricity. So we'll click that. And let's say that there were actually on-site renewables. There was a solar installation or a wind installation. You could click that here. Now, for any more sophisticated users that are interested in what's called market-based accounting, which recognizes certain financial instruments or mechanisms you may pursue like RECs or PPAs to decarbonize your energy supply, that is something that we are launching at the end of this week. So very excited to launch that here. So stay tuned and feel free to follow up with our sales team if you have any questions about that. But this is where you're entering all the energy in your building, right? So let's say you purchase steam, you can click that. Let's say you purchase cooling. And not only do you purchase cooling, but you know that for the chilled water that you're purchasing, that it's actually generated by an electric driven chiller, which is a pretty efficient piece of equipment. You can click that here because that's going to have a lower emissions impact than if it was generated by a natural gas chiller or an absorption chiller. And so you have the opportunity to actually reflect that level of granularity in the setup here, because as we know, if let's say, you're in a building and you've had to pay for some kind of a CapEx to support that energy retrofit, you had to pay for that equipment upgrade. And so the system wants to recognize the emissions benefit that you get from consuming energy from cleaner sources. And then, of course, for those that are just starting out, or maybe you're not the facility manager or have access to the facility manager, you just click unknown. You always have the opportunity here, and the system will default to an average number here, okay? And so this is the same thing here. Stationary combustion, if you're burning natural gas for space heating or water heating, you could click that here. And it's the same idea here, where let's say you were a tenant in that building and you paid in your CapEx charges, your CAM charges, for a conversion for the heating system to go from number 6 fuel oil, which has a larger emissions impact, than natural gas. Again, that's the system recognizing that impact. So same thing here. And you can always save your results. Now, I do want to point out, you'll always have the opportunity here. There's lots of guidance in terms of related definitions, which I actually already pulled up here, but you can always get some more insight. Any of these terms, go through our glossary here. as well as methodology. We're very transparent in how we are approaching these calculations. We want the users to understand the power of this tool, as well as any limitations or where assumptions are made. So every single one of our calculators will have this kind of overall impact, along with any limitations that are involved, and then the actual data sources of all the emissions factors that we're pulling from. And I will say that across all these calculation tools, we're actually hitting over 225 distinct countries and territories. Okay, so plenty to check out there. Back to the app, we save this. And now you'll see we're on the data configuration side. And so what you're able to do here is actually add in line items. Let's say you had 10,000 kilowatt hours of consumption. Immediately, you're actually getting the emissions impact right here. If you wanted to add cost, you could add the cost right here. A couple of project management helpful things. You can always add files here. If you wanted to upload your bill for an audit trail, if you're going to get this data verified, you can add any notes. We also have the ability to actually override the emissions. So let's say that your utility provider gives you an emissions impact and they're saying, you know, it's 2.06 instead of 2.07. You can put that here and have the ability to do that. And so it's just the same thing. I know we're running out of up on time, and so I'm going to try to move through this a little more quickly so I do have time for Q&A. But there's other opportunities here. You can do things like bulk import. And I do want to mention that this is dynamic to your configuration. So you'll see here the CSV, the line items are actually reflecting what we just went through in the configuration for this location, so that you set it up one time and then you have your import and you can just get all your data in. So just very quickly, some of the other categories we went through building, but again, the system will support emissions outputs for your buildings, your people, your business travel, and your commuting, waste that's generated, vehicles, any fuel powered trucks or equipment. These are all the categories that we have. We also have the ability for a custom category, which often gets used, frankly, for non-emissions related inputs. And we have a lot of users that want to, along with their environmental and emissions data, actually track social indicators like DEI or demographics or training programs. And so you can use this category to track along the same data hierarchy and structure in the application, any of those social programs. And then something I just want to point out here as well is events. This is different from formal annual emissions inventorying, but this is for any businesses that host a lot of conferences or meetings or workshops or events. If you want to be able to pursue a climate neutral event and be able to tell all the attendees and the stakeholders that you've neutralized the carbon impact for that event, you can actually go ahead and calculate here based off of some information around the people attending, the space that it's in, the kind of food you're serving, whether there was recycling in place. And I just want to show you very quickly how quickly, let's say you have an 1,000-person event and it's saying that 50% of the attendees are from out of town. You can see the system here is making assumptions about, oh, well, if half the people need to stay in lodging, here's actually the impact from staying in hotels. And as you move through this, it'll do the same across these other categories. So this is a great thing. And then once you fill this out, you can just purchase the offsets immediately so that you can tell your stakeholders that you are hosting carbon neutral events. So that is what I wanted to focus on from the app demo. I'm going to open it up for some Q&A. I know we only have 2 minutes. I'm sorry. These do have a tendency to go right up against the hour. So let me open up the Q&A app here. Okay, let's see. So since scope 3 accounts for 90% of all emissions, I heard some nonprofit recommend that you can try to reduce 90% of emissions and only 10% should be offset. I wonder if that's accounting for only scope 1 and 2, since scope 3 would be difficult to reduce or out of your control. This is a really great question. And this really has to do with getting to things like net zero, which is about deep decarbonization and reductions across your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. And that is a really important distinction between net zero and carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality allows for you to basically measure your emissions and then offset them. So you don't necessarily have to reduce them, right? It's about translating those business activities to a number and then purchasing offsets to kind of balance what your operation emitted by financing a project that would capture or otherwise avoid emissions from going into the atmosphere. And so that's a bit of a distinction. And so when you talk about your emissions profile, the goal, right, like what all of our global policies are based off of, is getting to net zero. We need to not just offset, which is a great place to start, but while you work on those more meaningful reductions, where we need to go is we actually need to reduce the emissions that are going out into the atmosphere, so that as an organization, you do need to manage those emissions and actually reduce them across your whole value chain. So that's a really good one. I think that we're just about at time, and I do want to be respectful of it. I'm sure we'll have some people dropping off. I see a bunch more questions. I will provide answers to these. So I want to thank everyone for joining. I know these go really fast. I will get written responses out. And I encourage anybody who has a question, if you want to see more about the application or you have questions, please just reach out to our sales team and we'll answer them. And I'm happy to hop on a call with any of you and further kind of dive into what this all means and how you can get started as a business. So thanks, everyone. And we will see you next time.